And then Gaza, as we've mentioned, very peculiar situation. There isn't a single Israeli civilian or soldier in Gaza, and yet it's still called occupied Palestinian territory. And this has been described by this writer and others as occupied through remote control. And people say, oh wait, but Israel occupies the borders and the airspace. Well, Israel controls the borders and the airspace, and that makes it an occupying power of the whole of Gaza. That definition has never been applied in history to any other territory, except this one. And I rather like this quote from Avinoam Sharon, who says, "It would seem that the Israeli occupation that may never have begun cannot ever be brought to an end." And I think that's a very perceptive comment. So there are five, just before we finish this section, 5 key counter-arguments to the illegality claim. Israel exercised her right to self-defense under the UN Charter. The Gaza and West Bank were never sovereign territories, so they weren't formally, legally occupied by Israel. And the Jewish settlement is in accord with the Article 80 of the UN Charter, which explicitly states that Jewish settlement in what the former mandated territory should be encouraged. And that in any case, Jordan, who was the only conceivable sovereign power in the West Bank, relinquished all claims to sovereignty as part of its peace treaty with Israel. And the Oslo Accords, if all else fails, point to the Oslo Accords, because that changed the legal framework of all of these territories. There was actually no bar on settlement building under the Oslo Accords. What Israel undertook to do in Area C, which is where most of the settlements are, what she undertook to do, although she wasn't required to, she undertook not to create new settlements, and she hasn't done that. And she undertook not to expand the settlements beyond their existing boundaries, and she hasn't done that. So whenever you hear about Israel expanding the settlements, what that means is perhaps a school has been built, or some new housing has been built, or a sewer is being repaired, and that's called a settlement. And so this raises an interesting question, and it comes back to some of the other questions I've been raising. This isn't actually a legal argument at all. The people who use the term illegal occupation and settlements don't know what they're talking about. And it's being used politically. And it's been used to delegitimize Israel and to Israel's claims to these territories. I haven't mentioned East Jerusalem, but we have the ludicrous situation whereby Jews living in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem are called settlers. But Palestinians living in West Jerusalem, that's fine. The more the merrier. Nobody minds that. But if a Jew lives in the Jewish quarter, that's a settler. So there are some contradictions and inconsistencies here, which doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, there's ignorance and or prejudice. So that's my third mini talk over. There's just one last one after this, which is relatively short. So again, I'll take any burning questions or points of information, and then hopefully we'll open it up to wider discussion. Yes, the two ladies at the front here.
I can understand that the general public, from what they hear on the BBC and different things, are brainwashed into all what we hear that we're doing to the Palestinians, etc., etc. But what I can't understand is you're not ignorant. You have put together this talk, and it stands up, and you've said that you can defend it, etc. But these other people in the Lancet, are they just listening to other people with no questions, nothing? That they're totally against Israel without, because there can't just be you. There must be others.
The usual response I get is that I'm a liar. That's it. That's it. That's all they say. Because they don't, I've given a number of talks around, particularly on the Palestinian health theme, not so much on the legal theme, but certainly on the health theme. Nobody has been able to challenge me on any of the evidence I've presented. And so what they resort to doing is they call me by name. They say I'm a liar, I'm a paid propagandist, though I don't get paid a penny, I can assure you. On the contrary, I get paid nothing. I'm doing this because I believe it's right.
Where are they getting their information?
That's something, could we come back to that later on? Because I think it's a crucial question. Yes, please.
I'm a little unclear about something you said about the settlements
Yeah.
in the 1973 war. You said that they saved Israel. Well, I mean, as far as I know, people who live in the settlements don't actually fight in the war. You know, I thought that they didn't join the army. People in settlements.
No. The vast majority of Israelis serve in the army. Those Israeli citizens who are exempt from the army are generally, are first of all the Israeli Arabs, okay, who by and large have not gone to settlements. And as you say, the ultra-Orthodox, the so-called Haredi Jews, who for religious reasons refuse to serve. Now, because of the image that we have of what a settler looks like, we think that those settlers are Haredi Jews. Now, some of them are, but the majority are not. And certainly in the 1973 war, the vast majority of them were secular Jews who were encouraged to go to these settlements because they were granted subsidies on mortgages, and there were new communities and the conditions were very favorable, and there were new jobs created and that kind of thing. So they were all reserve soldiers. The youngsters were serving in the regular army, and the older ones were serving in the reserve army. And so when the attack happened unexpectedly on Yom Kippur, they were able to mobilize some of these units. Now, sadly, I don't want to give the impression that that was a famous victory and Israelis didn't suffer, because they lost huge numbers of casualties. A very large number of Israelis were killed, but the country wasn't overrun. And the point that I'm making was that had those settlements not existed, arguably, this is debatable, I agree with that, arguably that war would have been lost. But the point that I'm making is that it validated the political argument that Israel's left-wing governments had made in establishing the settlements, that they were necessary for security. That was the point that I was making. That's okay. Yes? Yes, indeed. Nobody called it an occupation then. One of the curiosities of all of this is we keep hearing about what a tragic situation the Palestinians are in, because nobody has thought that they deserve a state, and nobody has granted them a state. Actually, the only country that has granted the Palestinians the right to statehood alongside Israel is Israel. Israel is the only country and that has actually taken measures to try and establish that embryonic statehood. Because between 48 and 67, when Egypt occupied Gaza and Jordan occupied the West Bank, they weren't offered a state. As far as we know, there was no vociferous demand for one, but that bit of history is forgotten when there was an opportunity to create, after all, nearly 20 years, nearly a generation. Why didn't it happen? And again, this comes back to the question of what is the motivation behind this kind of criticism? I think that's a very valid point that you've made. Let's quickly move on now to the last section, and then hopefully we'll be able to open it up to a more detailed discussion. This is what my hypothesis this evening is that everything that I've said up till now, that has been the hors d'oeuvre to the main course, which as far as Israel's critics are concerned is about this, getting rid of Israel. Now we know that there are some fanatics out there, particularly in the Middle East, that want to see Israel disappear, and the Iranian leaders, for example, have made no bones about it, and have repeatedly said that is their primary foreign policy objective. Despite the nuclear deal that has just been signed, we still hear comments of this kind being made on a near daily basis in Iran. We know that. And we also know that Iran supports Hezbollah and Hamas and a number of other Islamist organizations in the region, and none of those organizations is willing to contemplate the continued existence of Israel. So that's not a surprise. And if you look carefully at the logos and the emblems of these organizations, you will almost invariably find a map of Palestine buried in there. Palestine as they see it, from the river to the sea. But actually, we're not just talking about extremists. We keep hearing about the moderate Palestinian Authority. And these are quotes. On the top one is from a Palestinian school book, could never have been published without the approval of the Palestinian Authority. Broadcasts on Palestinian television, sermons from Palestinian preachers. The Palestinian Authority is not run on democratic lines. It's an authoritarian quasi-state. Nothing happens there without the approval of senior officials. That is the line that they're taking. And even as recently as a few weeks ago, Mahmoud Abbas has talked about the whole of Israel being occupied Palestinian territory. So this idea that this is an extremist notion that in any case is just rhetoric, that Israel should ignore, well, what about the so-called moderate opponents of Israel? It gets worse. Then you look at the international community. Look at this organization, UNRWA, that I mentioned earlier. These are their official school logos. Look at the maps. There's no place in Israel for those maps. Those are our taxes that are being used, incidentally, to support these organizations. Then there are the so-called pro-Palestinian organizations. I call them so-called pro-Palestinians. That's you may very well say so. I couldn't possibly comment. But look at the map. Yeah, I'm not showing it for making a political point, but in passing you might just want to clock that. But look at the map of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There is no room for Israel. They are not pro-Palestinians. There has been no PSC demonstration about the plight of Palestinians in Syria. Just in the last few weeks, over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in Syria. There are no demonstrations protesting at that. Hundreds of thousands. Sorry, I'll
What about 300,000 in Syria?
Yeah. When hundreds of thousands, something between 200,000 and 400,000 Palestinians were expelled, not by Israel, not during the War of Independence. After the first Gulf War, I've already mentioned that, by Kuwait, that was supported by the United States and Britain and the international coalition against Saddam Hussein, Kuwait expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. At no notice, there were no demonstrations, there was no expression of outrage, there were no editorials, there were no supplements in The Guardian. These are not pro-Palestinian organizations, these are anti-Israeli organizations. We mustn't be fooled by this. And it gets worse still. Because then when you look at civil society that apparently has nothing to do with the Middle East and nothing to do with the conflict and is not taking a political position, famous Glasgow publisher, HarperCollins, what are they doing publishing a textbook with no Israel in it? And I don't know if you've noticed, just in the last few days, CNN published a map in which they showed a number of Arab countries surrounding, guess what, Palestina. They've even invented a name for it. Well, there were protests and they took down that map, but we shouldn't have to protest about this. You know, I've just come back from Ireland. It would be like HarperCollins producing a map of the British Isles that didn't show Ireland on it because they believed Ireland should still be part of Britain. I dare say there are people who think that. This is a kind of mass pathology we're witnessing. Wikipedia. Sure, we've all used Wikipedia. I love these. And because I'm interested in music, I like to just see what they have to say about Israeli musicians. Daniel Barenboim is an Argentine pianist and conductor. He's Israeli. He grew up in Israel. He was born in Argentina. His family migrated to Israel. He grew up in Israel. He's Hebrew speaking. He has Israeli citizenship. It's not mentioned. Gil Shacham, one of my favorite violinists, an American violinist of Jewish descent. His parents were in the Israeli diplomatic corps. This is my favorite, Ilan Volkov, because he conducted the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. Wonderful conductor. This is my favorite. He's now back in Israel. Just look at this description. Ukrainian ancestry, German ancestry. Okay, Tel Aviv is mentioned. Where is Tel Aviv? The I word is not mentioned. This is becoming extremely widespread. It's not just when you fly on Emirates and you see the map of the Middle East come, which I do occasionally, and it really annoys me, but I'm not going to pick a fight while I'm 30,000 feet in the... But it's not just on the Emirates, it's happening all around us. And it's extremely common, and some of it is so subtle that it just slips beneath the radar. I really believe there's a sinister dimension to this. It's not necessarily conscious, but a lot of people are signing up to it. So just to finish off then, is attempted erasure of a country ever legitimate? I mean, the question itself it surely grates everybody in this room to even ask that question. But certainly, if it's been recognized by the United Nations as it has, it's actually illegal to try and erase a country recognized by the United Nations, even though Israel's enemies have been trying to do that from the very beginning. And yes, it might be a piece of the grave, as Begin said to Sadat when he was told, he was challenged, don't you want peace with the Egyptians? He said, yes, I want peace, but not peace without me, not the peace of the grave. So what should we do about it? Well, look, the first thing is, in meetings like this, to recognize that it's going on. Many, many people are not even aware of this. Even Israel's supporters are not aware of it. And to really make the point, this is unacceptable. This has nothing to do with your support or otherwise for a particular Israeli government or policy. We should name and shame the people who are involved in this, and we should use international legal means, such as the Security Council, although I'm not hugely optimistic about that one, or the International Court of Justice to try and counter it. So who should be doing it? Well, I've listed some people there. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, I dare say, do their best, but they're a relatively smaller, under-resourced organization. The United Nations and its agencies, in theory, should be doing something to protect one of its member nations, but you can be sure that it doesn't when it comes to Israel. All of these NGOs, many of which, throughout my adult life, I've come and gone from many of them. I've signed up because I thought they were good causes, and then unsigned when I realized what their position was in Israel. Why aren't they taking up this cause? It's a matter of universal human rights. And then that comes down to people like us in this room. There isn't anybody else, I'm afraid. It's us. It's down to us. If we feel strongly about it, it's down to us. We have to read about it. We have to educate ourselves about it. We have to talk to our friends and families about it. We have to talk to MPs, to colleagues in churches and NGOs, talk to the media about it. There is nobody else is going to do this for us if we believe it's important. So I'm just about finished the formal part of my talk now. I just want to finish with two questions, which I think that I hope this presentation has raised in all of our minds. Is criticism of Israel disproportionate? We hear that Israel is often accused of a disproportionate response to things happening around her. Are the critics of Israel being disproportionate? Let's look at the map. Let's just see where Israel is. Let's look at Israel's relative size. let's look at Israel's credentials to be criticized in relation to her neighbors. Just look at some of those neighbors. And yet we don't have calls for BDS, boycotts, sanctions against those. Sorry, just to go back. If we decide that Israel is being disproportionately criticized, my question is why? And I don't have an answer. You may think I do. I'm not going to play the anti-Semitism card, as Israel's critics often accuse supporters of Israel of doing. I'm not going to do that. I just think it's a legitimate question to ask. Why is this happening? Of course, underlying all of this enmity towards Israel is the conflict, the actual conflict. I've been talking about the war of ideas, the propaganda war, the war in the media. But there is a real conflict going on. And if only that conflict would stop, a lot of the noise around it would stop, hopefully. And people say, oh, it's too complex. Actually, it isn't, you know. It really isn't. This is a quote. The Arab-Israeli conflict is caused by the violent rejection of self-determination for the Jewish people. That's not my quote. That comes from Benny Morris, the Israeli historian, who was pilloried for years in Israel as being anti-Israeli. He was one of that group of young so-called revisionist historians who challenged the Israeli narrative. But he says now, ever since the Second Intifada, looking back on Arab-Israeli history, this is the conclusion he has reached. It's this rejectionism of Israel that drives the conflict, and I don't think there's any getting away from that. And if we could remove that rejectionism, the conflict will cease, and much of the so-called criticism will cease, I hope, also. And that's just a quote that I happen to like. I don't know why it's come out the way it has, but it has. But that's Tolstoy. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we do thank you, David, very much for sharing all your knowledge, and I know that there will be a lot of people like to comment, question, so it's over to you now. Yes, gentleman in the third row.
It just happens I'm at the moment reading,
Stand up.
I'm reading Martin Gilbert's Churchill and the Jews, and I'm just at the section on the British Mandate. And the comment was made about Arab rejection of Jews. Prior to the Second World War, the Arabs put extreme pressure on the United Kingdom government, on the British government, to stop immigration of Jews to Palestine, which the British were mandated to do, as has been told, and Britain did give in and restrict it. So that hostility predates the foundation of the State of Israel. But the other interesting thing that came out as well was that during the period when Jews were setting up and establishing themselves in Palestine after the mandate, the Jewish population grew, and so did the Arab population, because with the work done by the Jews in creating their settlements, bringing power, bringing water, bringing electricity, everything like that, employment, they attracted Arabs to the country. And if you actually look at the growth of population, it was roughly the same for the Jews and for the Arabs, who were coming in voluntarily to share with the development of what had been a desert prior to the mandate, and then something must have happened that the leaders, and I think the Mufti of Jerusalem was possibly responsible for this, suddenly turned around and thought, hang on, something's going wrong here. And they, of course, were shooting themselves in the foot by doing it, because, of course, the development was benefiting everybody. But like
Number of people coming out on this cold and rather soggy November night, and we're very pleased to welcome you all, whether you come from locally from our fellowship here or from the community round about us. We give you a warm welcome, and a particular welcome to David Stone, who's come to speak to us on this subject of Israel, truth and falsehoods. I guess we're all aware that there are a lot of truths and falsehoods on this subject. I go around speaking on this subject and writing in various magazines, and often you get all sorts of people telling you things which are, are completely untrue. And it's very hard sometimes to win the battle for speaking on Israel. And we're very grateful that David's come to hopefully enlighten us and will enlighten us on some of these subjects which he's going to talk about. So I'm not going to take up a lot of his time. I'm going to hand over straight over to David to lead us and to speak to us on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you especially to Ginny and Barbara, with whom I've been discussing the planning of this evening's event. It's nice every so often to experience a first in one's academic career. Now that I've retired, I feel I'm starting afresh, really. This is the first time I've addressed an audience in a church hall, and it's the first time I've given 4 lectures on the one occasion. What actually happened was Barbara and Janie invited me to suggest topics for tonight's talk. So I offered them 4, and they said, yes, please, we'll take all of them. And that hasn't happened to me in all these decades of lecturing. So I'm deeply flattered, first of all, to have been invited here, and secondly, to have had all my suggestions accepted. And as you'll hear, actually, although there are 4 topics, they're all highly interconnected with each other. Now, we all know that there's a tendency in modern discourse to portray Israel negatively. And what I find even more bizarre about this is not just the tendency to portray Israel negatively, but to portray falsehoods as truth and truth as falsehoods. That's actually going a step further than we normally think of as people's biases or preferences or political viewpoints. And that's something I really would like to explore with you this evening as we go along, and particularly at the discussion at the end of the session. What I want to do is to show you, using these 4 topics, that we are really involved in a propaganda war. Israel is involved in a physical war in the Middle East and has been since 1948. In addition to that, Israel is facing a propaganda war around the world. And there are a number of battlefields to this propaganda war. There are multiple battlefields. I've just identified 4 that I think highlight the nature of the problem. And as we go through them, you'll see what I mean. But my purpose this evening is to draw your attention to some of the things that are being said about Israel at a very high level. No, I'm not talking about chit-chat in bars and dining tables. I'm talking about high political level and at a very high professional level, some of the things that are being said. And I want to offer you some of my personal thoughts about how these should be dealt with. A, how to rebut them, and B, how to put forward what I would regard as a more truthful analysis of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, at this point, I want to make a couple of declarations. First of all, I have dual UK-Israeli citizenship, and I've lived in Israel and worked in Israel for a number of years. But I have no political allegiance to any Israeli political party, and I'm not here to advocate or support or defend any particular policy of either the current or any previous Israeli government. So I want to make that very clear. The second declaration I want to make is that I come from an academic background, as you'll appreciate. So everything I say, I can back up with evidence. And you can challenge me on that if you doubt me, and feel free to do so, because it's very good for me to be challenged. So if you hear me say something that you wonder about whether or not I'm being a bit strong there, challenge me, and I will try my very best to produce the evidence, because I believe, and I'll put my professional integrity on the line here, I believe that everything I say is evidence-based. Okay, let's go into the talks. After each of these mini lectures, if you like, I'm going to pause for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask the audience if anybody here has any burning questions or points of clarification or points of information that you would like to offer. But we'll try and keep that fairly brief so as not to interrupt the flow of the evening. And then when we get through to the end, by which time I hope you'll see some of the connections between these 4 themes, then I hope we'll be able to have a more interactive conversation about this subject and explore some of the implications for all of us, not just for Israel and for the Palestinians and for the Arab world, but for ourselves in this country, whether we're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or of no particular denomination at all.